much to actually do that.
Yeah.
You probably need to work through strategic alliances with institutions that are dedicated for microfinancing, institutions that have got the infrastructure to do it. Microfinancing involves very high transaction costs, very high infrastructure costs. And these institutions that are dedicated to do that, they are able to cope based on the pricing that they have.
Right.
So that collaboration is needed. And in our example, we try to do microfinancing, but we do not retail in terms of microfinancing. We do wholesale and we do portfolio on a portfolio basis. So I think what is important is the strategic alliance part.
Absolutely. I want to quickly come to my recommendations. Let me begin with you, and very quickly, we've got a minute left.
Okay, I think the most important take-home message would be to have a full understanding of the whole value chain, from the producer to the end consumer, understanding the different segments of the value chains and see where the finance can fit in. I think that's very important. The way to go about that is to have a more holistic approach, having a proper composition of the team when you design the project and when you implement the project. That is very important. And then also in the bank, I think what we want to take home is the creation of a knowledge network within the bank that has a proper understanding of what is value chains and what is value chain finance.
Yeah, that took one. Quickly.
I think we have to realize that SMEs with varying levels of capabilities and capacity have different demands. One of the biggest challenge for any DFI is not just managing developmental role, but also the pressure of trying to ensure that you are sustainable in terms of your ability to continue to do what you do.
Right.
So we have to face the fact that the pricing is going to be an issue. And if it is an issue, therefore, we have to realize that not all SMEs are of the same risk level. So you therefore have to start introducing risk-adjusted pricing. You have to ensure that the ones that are underserved, the ones that are really able to pay those kind of price, pays them.
Yeah.
And the ones that can help subsidize the lesser ones are able to do that as well.
Yeah.
But the art is perfecting that cross-subsidy element, because if you let it perpetuate, then that cross-subsidy will continue.
Yeah.
And government will forever be needing to put in more funds into the FIs.
Yeah, building sustainable enterprises. Better?
For me, really the closing remarks would be two. On the DFIs, I think the collaboration is important. I think we can all learn from each other. I mean, because we've gone through different times, we don't have to pay the school fees twice. I think that for me that's important. There's a lot of information. On the SMEs that are probably watching, or will be watching, is to make use of the development finance institutions. They have been established by the various governments to ensure that they make it relatively easier for you to access financing. I think it's important to access financing, but also DFIs, development finance institutions by their nature, would take a long-term view. And then lastly, as development finance institutions, we have a responsibility to ensuring that we crowd in the normal financial sectors. So by ensuring that by coming in and taking a higher risk, then they come in and then actually supplement.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Jimo?
Yeah, from me, in addition to what my colleagues have said, I think for the development finance institutions, I will say that we should show more commitment to rural development, because Africa, Asia, we are bogged down with the importance of opening up our rural areas.
Indeed.
And for the SMEs, I will also say that we need, in addition to the DFIs ensuring sustainability and being able to have good returns, they must provide the necessary technical assistance and top human resource personnel that will assist the SMEs in their planning processes. That is important, and that will make the money come back to the bank.
Indeed, Mr. Jimo, Vice Chairman of the Association of African Development Finance Institutions. I've got to go through the long route again. Thank you very much, Ms. Bena. Thank you. Datukwan, thank you. Christian, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to this first discussion, where we were focusing on increasing South-South cooperation among development finance institutions, and of course the very important role of ensuring that value chain financing is done right and the pricing is absolutely done correctly as well. We're taking a short break. When we come back, we shall be discussing the mechanisms that are required out of governments and the regulatory environment that's needed from governments to make sure that we are able to fully fund SMMEs and enhance the development of African countries. That's after the break. So I want to thank my guests. It's back in a minute. Welcome back to the third series of the IDC Dialogue Series, and we are focusing on the strategies needed to promote South-South cooperation among development finance institutions in Africa, the Asia-Pacific region, as well as the Caribbean. In the first part of the discussion, we focused on enhancing that cooperation in the South-South division of the DFIs, and then we also talked about value chain financing. In this part, we would like to focus on how governments can help create the environment that's needed for DFIs to work optimally, and what the DFIs themselves need to be telling governments to put in place so they're able to do their job to the best of our ability. Let me introduce my panel. These are all new guests, and I have, if I can begin from my immediate left, we've got Octavio Peralta. He asked me to call him Bobby. Bobby, thank you for coming. He is the Secretary General of the Association of Development Finance Institutions in Asia and Pacific. Next to him is Patrick Lamini. He is the CEO of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And then last but not least, we've got James Karanja. He's the board member of the Association of African Development Finance Institutions. Gentlemen, welcome. Let me begin with our distinguished visitor. Governments, of course, are a big player in terms of creating the environment in which we all operate. But we do know that SMEs in particular, the sector that we're targeting, do need an enabling environment created by governments. What do we want these governments to put in place to make sure that Patrick and other banks that are operating in this sector do their job to the best of their ability? From where you stand, from the experience of Asia.
Thank you, Geoffrey. From the perspective of the Asia-Pacific region, I think there's now more a realization that DFIs are important player in the financial system. There was a time when DFIs have been criticized for not doing its job well. And so what I'm trying to say is that government support is critical for DFIs to do their job well. Of course, that comes in the form of, in terms of providing support, perhaps
right.
in funding, policy support, also lending them with perhaps advice and linkages with other financial institutions.
Yeah. James, could I come to you perhaps and talk about the absolute minimums that we need from a regulatory perspective for DFIs to work properly?
Thank you. I would like to say that the governments basically are the owners of these DFIs.
Right. They are the shareholders.
They are the shareholders, yes, and they have invested money in those institutions. And it is their responsibility to ensure that these DFIs are challenged to perform, to ensure that a reasonable return, not maximum return, but a reasonable return is actually coming back to the shareholder. Yeah. Because the governments are actually investing public funds. And the public is actually expecting that their money is not going to be put to waste. Hence, there is need of ensuring that there is infrastructure in place in terms of good governance and also in terms of the regulatory framework, so that those financial institutions are going to give a return on whatever actually has been put in them that is back to the shareholders.
Let me come to you, Patrick. And I'm putting you in a slightly difficult position because as we're saying, you're talking to your shareholder.
Yes.
Minimum, what do you need? And what do we need to take out? If perhaps we can use the example of South Africa.
I think from my perspective, it's important that governments create the conducive environment for DFIs to operate and to operate effectively so that we can be able actually to ensure that there is maximum developmental impact. And it is also quite important for governments to ensure that the mandates that they give to DFIs as shareholders also points into the direction of maximum impact in the economy.
Do they need to deliberately favor DFIs?
DFIs create a catalytic environment for job creation and economic prosperity. Therefore, it's important for government to ensure that there's maximum and optimal support given to DFIs.
Right. Let's move the conversation to financial inclusion, because it's a big part of what we're talking about here. Because the people that we're trying to reach through DFIs are people normally out of our formal economies, from Asia. How do we ensure financial inclusion? How do we build the structures that enable us to reach the farmer who's down in Mpumalanga, versus, of course, the guys who are sitting in Soweto and are closer to technology and all these other advantages that we have in modern-day society?
Well, financial inclusion in our part of the world, especially through the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, is a big initiative in Asia. Because they realize that at least maybe more than 60% of the citizens there are not provided enough financial services, especially, as you mentioned, rural areas, people, artisans, and small businesses. So there has been an effort in terms of regulatory environment of providing assistance, whether through the development banks, the central banks, commercial banks,
right,
to be able to really go down to those who are excluded in accessing financial services.
Yeah. Patrick, how do we make sure that the guy in Limpopo actually knows that there's a DBSA and that actually it's there for him and he could make use of it?
That's a very interesting question, because the aspirant guy in Limpopo or Mpumalanga wants to succeed, and that guy wants the requisite support in terms of DFIs making sure that he's able actually to put his ambition into reality. And therefore, we need to make sure that these guys are able actually to access DFIs and are able actually to understand the requirements that they have to meet,
right,
for us to be able actually to successfully support them and to ensure that there is also technical support that is extended to these budding entrepreneurs. We have seen the world over how much of a role that guys from rural towns or SMMEs have played in ensuring that there is job creation for a much more broader, in a much more inclusive way. So those ordinary guys with their ambition need guidance, and we need to make sure that as DFIs we create platforms and facilities in such a way that actually are able actually to provide mentorship and to provide guidance and to advise them as to how they can be able actually to grow and become much more better and be able actually to operate at a much more sophisticated level.
Yeah. The other point you make, of course, is that SMMEs are actually should be an engine for job creation, and yet we are not fully maximize them. What is the problem there?
On the continent, I think that is one area where we've really come quite short, and I believe that we have a long way to go. Because on the continent of Africa, we have challenges of poverty. We have challenges of financial inclusiveness that we fail to achieve that. We have challenges of higher unemployment. And it has been proven the world over that SMMEs play such a critical role in creating economic opportunities for the unemployed, in eradicating poverty. I think if we were to look at the case of Brazil, we look at the case of India, it's been a classical case, and I think on the continent we really need to play much more greater emphasis in creating sustainable and thriving SMMEs. And as DFIs, we have a very critical role to play in that sphere.
James, what are your frustrations when you deal with governments in trying to make them understand the work that your organization does, the work that members of your organization, such as the DBSA, are doing to try to make sure that they are making a difference?
One of the problems that you find DFI facing, and especially in my own country, is that they're most like being left on their own as far as the handling of the lending is concerned. That support that we would be expecting from the major shareholder, who is actually the government, has not been forthcoming at a speed that you would expect. You'll find that role of job creation, that role of poverty alleviation
Yeah.
is being left basically to the mainstream banking sector.
Yeah, yeah.
And maybe
yeah.
to microfinancial institutions.
But that's ironic, isn't it? Because it is in the interest of the governments themselves to actually create jobs. Because
Yes.
by creating jobs, they can go to the electorate and say, tell you what, we are the guys with the answers to your job creation. And therefore, please put us back in office because we have created jobs. So why are they not working harder to reach the vast majority of the people who we know are outside of mainstream economies?
Well, I'm glad to see that that has been a main problem in the past.
Yeah.
But as of now, infrastructure is actually being put in place to ensure that the DFIs in Kenya, for example, the five DFIs in Kenya are actually major participants as far as this role is concerned.
Has there been a change? Are we beginning to see any kind of recognition improvement?
Yes, there is actually a change.
Would you agree, Patrick?
We've seen actually a huge change on the continent in terms of economic growth.
Yeah.
If we were to look at 1994, the continent combined GDP in dollar terms was about 500 billion.
Yeah.
And 2011, we're sitting at about 1.8 trillion US dollars in terms of GDP. And a lot of our countries actually have come out of a basket case, or so-called basket case, where we used to be so reliant on donors from the developed nations. And thanks to political guidance and political vision actually that we've seen, and now we need to say, then how then do we plug up the gaps, and the gaps around structural issues, the issue of infrastructure on the continent and the intertrade within the continent is a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And now we need to start paying much more big attention on aggressively developing infrastructure and infrastructure networks so that we can be able actually to enable trade within the continent.
Yeah.
So that again, then our guys can then be able actually to begin to then graduate to a bigger level in terms of international exposure.
Yeah. My last question before we go to the floor to open up for questions is to you, Bobby. Of course, part of the reason why you're here is that we want to learn from you. Of course, we want you to go and see the Big Five, but we want to learn from you first about how to enhance GFI's cooperation. From an Asian perspective, are you seeing that recognition within governments, and how did you make them understand that they need to do more and create the environment for DFIs to work better?
Well, first of all, I just want to add on the issue of government, because government, they have their hands full in so many things. In our part of the world, what's happening is it's the DFIs that's actually being proactive, providing them advice on how to go. So it's not always that the government should be able to support the DFI, but it's also the DFI that we try to also provide advice. So it's a close relationship between the owner and the DFI.
True.
So that's happening in our part of the world, and to increase this cooperation, I think it's a valid point and very important that the Africans and the Asians in this context through the DFIs are helping together.
Absolutely. You need to help them.
Both ways, actually.
Let's see if we can share some common experiences in trying to develop DFIs around the African continent, learning from the lessons that we have from Asia. As I said before, the session is now open for questions or contributions from the floor. If you can keep them short and sharp, we would like to take your questions. We've got a hand here right at the front. Thank you, sir.
I would like to suggest that can't we take this cooperation further? Rather than be just study tours, say, by African delegates to Asia and the Pacific, we have exchange programs where we can, for example, position our staff to learn specific sectors, how you handle specific issues and sectors. And the same thing with the guarantee schemes, that perhaps in Africa where they are not even provided for, maybe the Asia Pacific consider assisting us, setting up those guarantee schemes in such areas so that we can learn. And clearly they have had a greatest impact in terms of job creation. So can't we take this to a higher level, higher gear? I think that's my comment.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. I think it's a valuable contribution, exchange programs, and assistance setting up those credit guarantee schemes. So can I begin with you?
Yeah, actually, in ADFIAP, we've been doing the immersion programs. As you said, these officers of one institution is learning from one institution. We call it DFI to DFI exchange. So they're not only learning through training, but also observation, immersion, and observation in a particular DFI. So that's being done, and you're right, perhaps there's scope for African DFIs to also do the same thing in Asia and also vice versa.
Absolutely. I think it's a question also for the African Association.
Yes, actually what has happened so far is that we have had the African CEOs visiting Korea and also India. And I would say that this is just the beginning. I can see this being extended further to ensure that we have got the exchange programs covering, or going down to the staff members, that is, of the various institutions, so that they can be able to learn exactly what the Asians are doing that we are not doing, that we can be able to develop our DFIs. And also, as far as the implementation of these exchange programs, I'm looking forward to a time when the various countries, various governments are going to liaise with the from Kenya are going to liaise with other various governments, that is in Asia, who have actually been able to perfect the art, so that they can be able to learn on how to ensure that the same guarantees are applicable here, so that we can actually be able to put together and ensure that poverty alleviation, job creation, and also economic development actually is achieved in the countries in Africa.
We can take more questions. There's a hand right there.
Mr. Facilitator, when you start your questions, you raised a quite interesting point. What is the bottom line for the FIs? And I got the impression that we received two different answers, which is good. But one puts emphasis on the ownership, state ownership. The other answer put emphasis on the conducive environment. I think this is important to debate these differences, because the idea that DFIs must be absolutely state-owned, it's not part of my experience. And I do not see it as a basic condition. I am myself, I am the CEO of a DFI that exists for 22 years, and from the very first day, it was a public-private partnership. And is still surviving, is growing. All others, absolutely parastatal, they have died, they have bankrupted. It's important because in some countries, and we have to recognize this quite honestly, in some countries where our states are still fragile, governance is not yet very strong, the principle of public-private partnership works very well. So what I do believe is some of our governments are not yet well prepared. And this is very important, to interact with them, to create a conducive environment to promote finance for development. This is my comment. The second point, it's also the concept that DFIs are something one size fits all. I have some doubt on this. DFIs for big infrastructure projects do not have conditions to play a role on rural SMEs projects. So I think also in the FIs, as well in many other things, one size doesn't fit all. But unfortunately, some of our governments with a new resource, they tend again to create new big elephants. One size fits all. There's a risk. Yeah. And I'd like to receive your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I think it's an important point. Should DFIs be solely state-owned? Do we need private money in DFIs, or are governments the sole provider for long-term finance? Patrick, you want to come in? I want to open it as well to our previous panelists to answer this question, should they feel they want to contribute.
I do agree. I don't think you'll ever have a situation where one size fits all. But at the same time, PPPs require a radical change in regulatory environment to enable the creation of PPPs actually to happen. In developing countries, you find that that's where you tend to have a much more bigger challenge. But for DFIs to be successful, it is extremely vital that